When did my inheritance turn into a death sentence? The lawyer slid the envelope across his mahogany desk, and I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he released it. Your uncle's will was very specific about when you could open this, he said, avoiding eye contact. You're to read it alone immediately, and then burn the contents within 24 hours. I stared at the thick manila envelope with my name written in Uncle Victor's spidery handwriting, feeling the weight of something more than paper inside. Behind the lawyer, rain streaked the windows of his 19th floor office, and somewhere in the building's ventilation system, a rhythmic thumping started that sounded disturbingly like a heartbeat. What's in it? I asked, but Gerald Finch was already standing, gathering files, creating distance between himself and whatever my inheritance contained. I don't know, he said, though his expression suggested otherwise, but your uncle paid me a considerable sum to ensure you received it exactly 3 days after his funeral. That was yesterday. I fulfilled my obligation. He was at the door before I could ask anything else, leaving me alone with an envelope that suddenly felt dangerous. I left his office and drove straight to my apartment in Cambridge, the envelope on the passenger seat radiating menace like something radioactive. Traffic on Memorial Drive gave me too much time to think about Uncle Victor's last phone call, the one where he'd sounded terrified and kept saying he needed to tell me something but not over the phone. We'd arranged to meet for dinner. He canceled. Called back a week later, even more paranoid. Mentioned people watching him, old mistakes catching up. Then the boating accident, the closed casket funeral, distant relatives I'd never met describing a man I thought I knew. I parked in my building's garage and sat in the darkness for 10 minutes, holding the envelope up to the dim overhead light, trying to see through the thick paper. The weight of it felt wrong, like it contained more than documents. Finally, I took it inside, locked my apartment door, and sat at my kitchen table with a knife. Inside were 3 items: a letter in Victor's handwriting, a USB drive, and a key attached to a tag with an address in Somerville. The letter was dated 2 months before his death, and his handwriting was shakier than usual, letters slanting differently, as if he'd been writing under stress. I started reading, and the floor dropped out from under my understanding of everything. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine. The words blurred as I read about something called Synthesis 9, a cognitive enhancement compound Victor had created 23 years ago. Miraculous trial results. Then people started dying years later, deaths staged as accidents because the compound metabolized completely, leaving no trace in autopsy. 100% fatality rate within 5 to 7 years. The company he'd worked for, Meridian Therapeutics, had covered it up because Synthesis 9 had military applications worth billions. Enhanced soldiers with improved reaction times and decision-making. All dead within 7 years. But who cared when you could create the perfect soldier? I kept records, Victor had written. I documented everything because I knew someday the truth would need to come out. Those records are on the USB drive, and they're the reason I'm dead. I set the letter down, hands numb. My uncle hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered for what he knew, and now he'd passed that lethal knowledge to me. The USB drive sat on my kitchen table like a small black bomb. The key's address was probably a storage unit with additional evidence. I picked up the letter again. You're not just my heir, you're the only person I trust to do what's right. Take the evidence to the authorities, but be careful who you trust. Meridian has connections everywhere. People who've tried to expose them before have disappeared or been discredited. By reading this letter, you've just become their next target. I looked at my apartment door, suddenly aware of how thin it was, how easily it could be kicked in. The building's security was a joke. Anyone could follow a resident inside. The letter continued with instructions about the storage unit, physical copies of research documentation, original trial results, autopsy reports Victor had somehow obtained, a list of everyone who'd received Synthesis 9, including their current status. Most dead. The survivors wouldn't last another year. These were real people with families. They trusted us to help them, and we killed them slowly while they thanked us for the treatment. Victor's guilt bled through every word. I can't undo what I did, but you can make sure it never happens again. Expose Meridian, make them pay, and most importantly, stay alive long enough to do it. Destroy this letter after reading, guard the evidence, trust no one. I sat there processing the implications. My inheritance wasn't money or property. It was a death sentence wrapped in moral obligation. Victor had made me responsible for exposing a pharmaceutical company that killed people and had enough power to make whistleblowers disappear. My doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my building required a buzzer code to access the lobby. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits standing in my hallway, looking professional and patient and somehow wrong. Every instinct screamed danger. "Can I help you?" I called through the wood, not opening it. The taller man smiled without warmth. "Mr. Castellano, we're from Meridian Therapeutics. We understand you've inherited some materials from your uncle that belong to the company. We'd like to discuss retrieving them." It had been less than 2 hours since I'd left the lawyer's office. They'd been watching, waiting to see who received Victor's inheritance. Now they were at my door, asking politely for the evidence that could destroy them. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, backing away. "My uncle left me some personal effects. Nothing related to his work. The second man's voice was flat and factual. Your uncle stole proprietary research materials. That's theft of corporate intellectual property. We can resolve this quietly and compensate you, or we can involve law enforcement and make this very complicated. Which would you prefer? I grabbed my phone, the USB drive, and the key, shoved them in my jacket pocket while the men outside knocked again, harder this time. Mr. Castellano, we know you're in there. We can see your car in the garage. Let's handle this like adults. I moved to my bedroom window, looked down at the fire escape that led to the alley behind my building. 3 stories up, but manageable. The knocking became pounding. Mr. Castellano, you have 10 seconds to open this door before we open it ourselves. I climbed out the window, feet finding the rusted metal of the fire escape, and started descending as fast as I could without falling. Above me, I heard the unmistakable sound of my apartment door being kicked in. They weren't even pretending to be lawful anymore. I jumped the last 6 feet to the alley, landed hard enough to feel it in my ankles, and ran. My car was in the garage, which meant they'd be watching it. I ran toward Massachusetts Avenue, joining the evening crowd of students and professionals walking between Harvard and MIT, lost myself in the flow of people while my heart hammered against my ribs. Victor's letter had said to trust no one, which meant I couldn't go to the police because Meridian had connections everywhere, couldn't go to friends because I'd be putting them in danger, couldn't even use my credit cards because they could track those. I had maybe $200 in cash, a USB drive full of evidence, and a key to a storage unit I couldn't safely access. The 2 men from my apartment were probably searching it now, finding the burned remains of Victor's letter in my kitchen sink because I'd had just enough time to light it before they arrived. At least I'd followed that instruction. I walked for an hour, constantly checking behind me, until I found a cheap motel in Somerville that accepted cash and didn't ask questions. The room smelled like cigarettes and defeat. I sat on the bed with its questionable stains and tried to think strategically. Victor had said Meridian had connections everywhere, but everywhere wasn't literally everyone. There had to be journalists, investigators, someone who'd built a career on exposing corporate crimes and would have the resources to protect themselves and their sources. I used the motel's ancient computer in the lobby to search for investigative reporters who'd covered pharmaceutical scandals. Found a name that kept appearing, Julia Whitmore, a journalist with the Boston Globe who'd broken stories about opioid manufacturers and medical device companies. She'd won awards for investigative journalism and had a reputation for protecting sources even when threatened with legal action. If anyone could help me expose Meridian, it was her. I wrote down the Globe's office address and phone number, then cleared the browser history and returned to my room. Sleep was impossible. Every sound in the hallway made me tense, waiting for my door to be kicked in. I kept the USB drive in my pocket, kept my shoes on, kept the window unlocked for a quick escape. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps stop outside my room, saw the shadow of feet in the gap under the door. Someone tried the handle quietly, testing if it was locked. I grabbed the chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then moved to the window. The footsteps moved on, but I knew it wasn't paranoia. They were searching for me, checking every cheap motel and hostel in the area. I had until dawn at most before they found this place. I climbed out the window, dropped into the parking lot, and started walking toward downtown Boston. The Globe's offices didn't open until 9, which gave me 6 hours to stay invisible in a city where I'd lived my whole life, but suddenly felt like enemy territory. I spent those hours in a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee and watching the door. Every person who entered got evaluated as either threat or neutral. The waitress eventually asked if I was okay, noting the way I kept checking the exits. Just waiting for someone, I lied, and she nodded but kept glancing at me with concern. At 8:30, I walked to the Globe's offices, a modern building near downtown with security at the entrance. I told the guard I needed to speak with Julia Whitmore about a story. He made a call, spoke quietly, then told me she wasn't available. It's about Meridian Therapeutics, I said, loud enough for the phone to pick up. And corporate murder covered up for military contracts. The guard's expression shifted. He spoke into the phone again, listened, then handed me a visitor badge. 6th floor. She'll meet you in conference room B. Julia Whitmore was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that assessed me instantly. She sat across the conference table with a recorder between us and got straight to it. You look like you haven't slept. You're scared. And you mentioned Meridian Therapeutics, which is interesting because I've been investigating them for 8 months. So, tell me why you're here. I pulled out the USB drive and set it on the table. My uncle was Victor Castellano. He worked for Meridian 23 years ago and created something called Synthesis 9. It killed everyone who received it, but the deaths were staged as accidents. Meridian covered it up because the compound had military applications. My uncle documented everything, and now he's dead, and they're trying to kill me for the evidence. Julia's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. Victor Castellano died 3 weeks ago in a boating accident off the coast of Maine. Are you saying it wasn't an accident? I nodded. He wrote me a letter saying he was dead because of what he knew. He gave me all his research. She picked up the USB drive, turning it over in her hands. If what you're saying is true, This is the biggest pharmaceutical scandal since thalidomide, but I need to verify everything before I can publish. That means time, which sounds like something you don't have. I told her about the men at my apartment, about being forced to run, about spending the night hiding in motels. Julia listened, without interrupting, then made a decision. I'm going to look at what's on this drive. If it's what you say it is, I'll protect you as a source and we'll figure out how to keep you safe while I build the story. But you need to understand something. Meridian has killed to keep this quiet. They'll kill to keep it quiet now. You came to me, which was smart, but also means you just painted a target on both of us. She plugged the USB drive into her laptop and started reviewing files. I watched her expression change from skeptical to horrified as she read through Victor's documentation. This is real, she said after 20 minutes. Clinical trial data, autopsy reports, internal memos about covering up adverse effects. There are names here, dates, specific details about how they staged deaths to look like accidents. She looked at me with new intensity. Your uncle was involved in something monstrous, but he tried to make it right. The question is whether we can expose this before Meridian realizes you've given me the evidence. She made several phone calls, speaking in careful language about a major story breaking and needing legal support. Then she turned back to me. I'm taking you somewhere safe. The Globe has a security team for high-risk sources. You'll stay in a protected location while I verify everything and build the story for publication. But first, you mentioned your uncle left a key to a storage unit. We need that physical evidence too. Everything on this drive could theoretically be fabricated. Physical documents are harder to dispute. The storage unit address was in Somerville, a 10-minute drive that felt like walking into a trap. Julia insisted on bringing a photographer and a security consultant, a former cop who'd worked protective details. We arrived at Secure Store on Prospect Street just after noon, the facility a sprawling complex of orange doors and security cameras. Unit 214 was on the second floor, accessed by an external stairway that left us exposed. I used Victor's key to open the padlock, and the door rolled up to reveal a space packed with filing boxes, each labeled with dates and project names. Julia started photographing everything before we even touched the contents. The security consultant, a man named Derek Paulson, kept watch at the stairway entrance. I opened the first box and found clinical trial documentation from 23 years ago. Patient names, treatment protocols, initial results showing miraculous cognitive improvement. Then the follow-up reports, dated years later, documenting deaths that had been ruled accidental but showed a clear pattern. How many people? Julia asked, photographing the documents as I laid them out. I counted through the files. Initial trial had 48 subjects. 39 are confirmed dead. The remaining 9 are listed as alive but deteriorating. I found photographs clipped to files, pictures of real people with families. A woman named Dorothy Kemper, who'd been a school teacher with early-onset Alzheimer's. Synthesis 9 had reversed her symptoms completely. She'd gone back to teaching for 3 years before dying in a car accident that the police report described as losing control on a straight road in clear weather. A man named Robert Chen, who'd been a violinist, losing his coordination to Parkinson's. The treatment had restored his ability to play. He drowned in his bathtub 2 years later, a death ruled accidental, despite having no history of seizures or health issues that would explain it. Every file told the same story. Miraculous recovery, followed by suspicious death years later when the compound's delayed toxicity finally manifested. Derek Paulson's voice cut through my reading. We've got company. I looked up to see 2 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot below. Doors opened and 4 men emerged, moving with military precision toward the stairway. We need to leave now, Derek said, but there was only one exit and they were blocking it. Julia was already on her phone calling the police, but we all knew they wouldn't arrive in time. The men started up the stairs, and I recognized one of them from my apartment. Mr. Castellano, he called up. You're trespassing in a storage unit rented under a false name. We're authorized to perform a citizen's arrest until police arrive. It was a lie wrapped in legal language, buying them time to take the evidence and probably take us too. Derek pulled out his own phone, started live streaming on his personal account. I'm documenting everything, he shouted down. Whatever you're planning, it's being recorded and uploaded in real time. The men paused, calculating whether violence on camera was worth the risk. Julia grabbed my arm. There's a back way through these units. They share wall space. If we can break through, we can access the next unit and escape through their door. It sounded insane, but we were out of options. Derek kept filming while Julia and I attacked the thin metal wall separating our unit from the next one. It took precious seconds to bend it enough to squeeze through. We could hear the men reaching our floor, their footsteps heavy on the metal walkway. We crawled through into the neighboring unit, disturbing someone's stored furniture and Christmas decorations. The padlock on this door was on the outside, impossible to open from within. Derek came through last, still filming, and we were trapped in a unit with no exit and men pounding on the door of the unit we'd just left. Window, Julia said, pointing to a small ventilation opening near the ceiling. It was barely large enough for a person, but it was our only option. She boosted me up first, and I squeezed through the opening, dropping onto an adjacent rooftop that serviced the building's air conditioning units. Julia came through next, scraping her arms on the metal frame, then Derek with the camera still rolling. We could hear the men breaking into our original unit, then the sounds of them discovering we'd escaped through the wall. "They're going to find this roof access," Derek said, already moving toward the edge of the building. A fire escape led down to a different section of the parking lot. We descended fast, hearing shouts from above as the men realized where we'd gone. Julia's car was on the opposite side of the facility. We ran for it, loading the boxes we'd managed to grab through the wall escape. Not all the evidence, but enough. The SUVs were already moving, trying to cut us off before we reached the exit. Julia drove like someone who'd done high-speed pursuits before, cutting through traffic and running a red light to put distance between us and our pursuers. Derek was still live-streaming from the back seat, narrating everything for his 3,000 followers. "Corporate thugs just tried to trap us in a storage facility," he was saying. "We have evidence of pharmaceutical murder and military cover-up. If anything happens to us, investigate Meridian Therapeutics and Synthesis 9. We drove to the Globe's offices, where security met us at the entrance and escorted us inside. Julia's editor, a steel-haired woman named Patricia Knowles, took one look at our disheveled appearance and the boxes we were carrying and cleared the main conference room. "Tell me this is worth the lawsuit Meridian's lawyers are probably drafting right now," she said. Julia spread the documents across the table, explaining Victor's research and the 23-year cover-up. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally picking up a document to examine it more closely. When Julia finished, Patricia made a decision. "We publish tomorrow. Front page, full investigation, everything we can verify in the next 18 hours. We'll have lawyers screaming at us before the ink dries. But if this is real, we have an obligation to expose it." She looked at me. "You're the source on all this. You understand that Meridian will come after you legally, financially, possibly physically. The Globe will protect you as much as we can, but there are limits to what we can do against a company with unlimited resources." I understood, but it didn't matter anymore. Victor had made me responsible for this truth, and people had died because of what Meridian had hidden. "Publish everything," I said. "Just make sure the world knows what they did." The next 18 hours were a blur of fact-checking, legal reviews, and additional reporting. Julia contacted families of the deceased trial participants, got statements from several who'd always suspected their loved ones' deaths weren't accidental. She found a former Meridian employee who'd been paid to stay silent but was willing to go on record now that there was corroborating evidence. The story grew beyond just Synthesis 9 to a broader pattern of Meridian prioritizing profit over safety, of regulatory capture that allowed them to operate with minimal oversight, of military contracts that made them too valuable to prosecute. By midnight, we had a 20,000-word investigation with supporting documents and multiple sources. Patricia scheduled it for the morning edition with an online release at 6 a.m. to maximize impact. I spent that night in a hotel room paid for by the Globe, with Derek Paulson standing guard outside my door. Couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion, kept thinking about the 48 people in Victor's trial who'd trusted a treatment that killed them, about their families who'd never known the truth, about my uncle who'd lived with that guilt for 23 years before finally trying to make it right. Around 4 in the morning, Derek knocked and told me Julia wanted me at the office for the official release. We drove through empty Boston streets to the Globe building, where the newsroom hummed with pre-dawn energy. Patricia gathered everyone for a brief meeting about security protocols and media requests they'd be fielding. "This is going to be massive," she said. "Meridian stock will tank, federal investigations will open, people will lose their jobs, and possibly face criminal charges. It's also going to be dangerous. Anyone working this story needs to take precautions. Vary your routes, check your cars, trust your instincts if something feels wrong." The story went live at 6 a.m. Within an hour, it was trending on social media, picked up by national news networks, and generating congressional response. By 8 a.m., Meridian's stock had dropped 30%. By 9, the FBI announced they were opening an investigation into the allegations. By 10, the company's CEO released a statement denying everything and promising legal action against the Globe for defamation. I watched it all from the conference room, feeling disconnected from the chaos I'd unleashed. Julia sat beside me, refreshing her inbox to field media requests. "You did the right thing," she said. "These people deserve justice, and now they're going to get it." But the satisfaction I'd expected to feel didn't come. Instead, there was just exhaustion and awareness that my life would never be normal again. Meridian would come after me, legally, if not physically. I'd be in courts and depositions for years. The inheritance Victor left me wasn't money. It was a war I hadn't chosen but couldn't abandon. That afternoon, federal agents arrived at the Globe to take my official statement and collect the physical evidence. They were polite but thorough, asking questions about Victor's state of mind, his communication with me, my exact movements since receiving the inheritance. One agent, a woman named Lisa Hendricks, who introduced herself as part of a corporate fraud task force, seemed particularly interested in whether Victor had mentioned anyone else who might have helped him document Meridian's crimes. "Your uncle couldn't have gathered this evidence alone," she said. "Someone inside the company must have been feeding him information. If we can identify that person, we can build a stronger case." I told her I didn't know, that Victor had been paranoid and secretive, but I promised to review everything for any hints about other sources. The agents left with boxes of documents, promising to keep me updated on the investigation's progress. 2 days after publication, Meridian's board forced the CEO to resign. 3 days after, the Department of Defense suspended all contracts with the company pending investigation. A week after, the first criminal indictments came down against executives who'd been involved in the Synthesis 9 cover-up. The families of deceased trial participants filed a class-action lawsuit seeking damages. Media coverage was relentless, with talking heads debating corporate ethics and military-pharmaceutical cooperation. Victor's role in creating Synthesis 9 came out, along with his decades of guilt and final attempt at redemption. Some people called him a hero for exposing the truth. Others called him a murderer who'd enabled the deaths. Both were accurate. I gave interviews carefully vetted by the Globe's lawyers, always emphasizing that Victor had tried to stop Meridian from using his research for military applications, that he'd documented their crimes knowing it would eventually cost him his life. The death threats started in week 2. Anonymous emails promising I'd join my uncle in the ocean. Voicemails describing what they'd do to me for destroying good people's livelihoods. The Globe increased security, and I moved between locations every few days to stay unpredictable. Derek Paulson became my constant shadow, a security detail I couldn't afford, but the newspaper insisted on providing. Julia continued investigating, following new leads that emerged from her initial story. She discovered that Synthesis 9 wasn't the only questionable compound Meridian had developed. There were others, different applications, same pattern of cutting corners and covering up adverse effects. The scope of corporate malfeasance was staggering. I started working with her as a researcher, using my uncle's contacts and knowledge to dig deeper into Meridian's history. It gave me purpose beyond just surviving. 3 months after the initial publication, I received a letter from Dorothy Kemper's daughter. She was one of the trial participants who died in a suspicious car accident. "Thank you for giving us answers," the daughter wrote. "For 20 years, I've wondered if my mother's death was my fault somehow, if I'd missed signs of confusion or illness that explained why she crashed. Now I know it wasn't her fault or mine. It was corporate greed and criminal negligence. That doesn't bring her back, but it lets me stop blaming myself. Your uncle created the thing that killed her, but he also gave us the truth. That's something." I kept that letter on my desk as a reminder of why the inheritance mattered despite the danger it brought. Victor had turned me into a target, but he'd also given me the tools to prevent future victims. The death sentence he'd passed to me was also permission to fight back against people who believed they were too powerful to face consequences. The trials took 2 years. Meridian executives faced federal charges ranging from fraud to manslaughter. The company settled the class-action lawsuit for $800 million, distributed among families of victims and survivors of other questionable treatments. Several executives received prison sentences. The company itself declared bankruptcy, unable to survive the financial and reputational damage. Military contracts were permanently severed. Regulatory agencies that had failed to catch Meridian's violations faced their own investigations and reforms. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more than most corporate criminals received. I testified at 4 separate trials, each time describing Victor's final letter and the evidence he'd preserved. Defense lawyers tried to destroy my credibility, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence for attention or money. But the documentation was too thorough, too consistent, too corroborated by other sources to dismiss. Julia's reporting earned her a Pulitzer nomination. The Globe's investigation became a case study in journalism schools about holding powerful institutions accountable. 5 years after opening that envelope in Gerald Finch's office, I finally visited Uncle Victor's grave. He's buried in a small cemetery in Vermont near the summer house he'd mentioned, but I'd never inherited because it had been sold to pay for lawyers who'd helped him prepare the evidence package. The headstone is simple. Just his name and dates and no description of who he was or what he'd done. I stood there trying to figure out how I felt about the man who'd created something that killed 48 people, then destroyed his life trying to make it right, then passed that destruction on to me. The inheritance he'd given me did turn into a death sentence, but not the way he'd meant. It killed the normal life I'd planned, the anonymity I'd taken for granted, the belief that powerful institutions eventually faced justice on their own, but it also gave me purpose and connected me to something larger than myself. Victor's guilt had become my responsibility, and his attempt at redemption had become mine too. I left flowers on his grave and drove back to Boston, where Julia was waiting with a new lead about another pharmaceutical company that needed investigating. Because the inheritance wasn't just one envelope or one fight, it was the understanding that some things are worth dying for and that the best way to honor the dead is to prevent more people from joining them. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.